All right, hello everybody, welcome back. Today's Forward Together webinar is led by the members of the Trust Coalition, namely Christopher Cuevas, Rasha Mubarak, Esteban Garces, and Jonathan Elingu. This week's webinar is designed to provide the history and a brief overview of the passing of the historic Fair Treatment for All Trust Tax policy in the city of Orlando and the city of Kissimmee in 2018. My name is Sayon, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. And I'm also the director of the Learn, Share, and Change project that includes this webinar series. In addition to the webinar series, that's running until August 14th, we're also conducting a statewide online survey to develop long-term goals and strategies to make Florida a more inclusive and immigrant-friendly space for everybody. Please check out our website, weavetales.org/forward-together for more information. And now I would like to start by introducing our four wonderful speakers we have today. Our first speaker, Esteban, is a founding member of Poder Latinx and Poder Latinx co-executive director. And the following speaker will be Jonathan, who currently serves as a co-director for Central Florida Jobs with Justice and has been involved in social justice organizing work for more than 10 years. Christopher is the next speaker, and Christopher is the executive director of QLatinx and serves on the board of directors for the Peace and Justice Institute. And lastly, but not least, Rasha is the president of Unbought Power, with more than 15 years of experience as a bilingual progressive organizer and political strategies. Please warmly welcome all of our speakers, and if you have any questions to the webinar, you can leave them in the chat, in the Q&A chat, and we'll have them answered at the end of the presentation. And also, for some reason, if you get kicked out of the Zoom meeting, you can use the same Zoom link to log back on. So I think it's time to dive in. Esteban, are you ready? Would you like to start by giving us a background on the Trust Coalition and how it started out?
Sure. Thank you again, Sam, for the opportunity, and it's good to see everyone from the coalition here as well. The Trust Coalition has its roots in Orlando just after the election. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll speak on both the photos in the next slide. On the left, you'll see a photo of an emergency meeting that we put together at MFE just after the election. The impetus for that was, the day after the election, many staff that worked for this organization I was with had a call in 2016, the 2016 election presidential, to kind of debrief how folks felt. And there was a lot of anxiety, there were a lot of tears, a lot of, we put our best in and things didn't turn out the way we hoped. And then, there was a real concern about what happens next to our community. It was a very, I think, healthy conversation to have, to get that out there. And just after this call, I received a couple of calls from community members also expressing the same concerns. So what we did is we put together an emergency community meeting on Thursday, 2 days after that election, to explore this further and provide community the opportunity to share these feelings with elected officials. Some were recently elected, some had been in office, and have those elected officials hear from the community directly. So that photo that you'll see, I'm not sure if it's on the screen yet, but there's about 60 folks in total at this emergency community meeting that was put together very short, last minute, and a variety of elected officials also there. The community did have their opportunity to share their feelings and how they felt, and the elected officials, took it all in. And after the community spoke, we asked the elected officials to respond. And each one of them showed empathy, they shared concern, and we made sure that, we got their commitment. The commitment was kind of just unclear, loose, but it was very much on the record. Do you have a commitment to show solidarity with this community for when this community calls on you? And the answer was yes, from each one of those elected officials. So that meeting ended, and there was a cohort of that community meeting that stayed behind because they wanted to continue exploring this. They wanted to do something. And they said, we have to do something. To quote in Spanish, is, tenemos que hacer algo. We have to do something. And some of those folks I had been meeting with in 2018 before the election, before the summer, to talk about politics and, get to know them better and know what they would like to see this organization be that I was leading in Florida. but after that community meeting, it kind of just came back together again with more drive and more commitment. And after hearing the stories from the community, elected officials, we started meeting weekly as community to figure out what are the next steps, what can we do, what can we explore. And around that time as well, that community group chose someone to represent them in spaces with partners. So we started meeting with partners to explore the same thing, and we had formulated something that could take off in the idea of maybe stopping immigration enforcement with collaboration with police. And we had a meeting with the first one, I think, was with Unite Here. Just to chat, what's the interest? Are you all there? Where's Unite Here right now? Could this be something we explore together? And, there were one-on-ones that were happening with these different organizations, and enough that we had, I think we had enough one-on-ones that hold a meeting, right? Let's have a conversation, a meeting. And the photo on the right is one of those meetings that we had with other partners who were interested in also exploring this idea of immigration enforcement and local police collaboration. So we started having a series of meetings, and I don't think the space had a name yet, but we were convening. There was synergy. There were folks that felt along the same lines, and that brought us together. And there was a focus, right? The focus was around immigration enforcement and local police collaboration. I just want to wrap up to say, I think, just to stay within time, that Donald Trump ended up becoming an organizing tool, where at first it was, a lot of fear, a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety. Do we send our kids to school? What do we do? This cloud over us is going to inspire us to take action. And that's what drove the initial conversations of putting together a space where community would have a presence in a space amongst other partners. What that was going to be was still unclear, but it ended up becoming what we now know as the Trust Orlando Coalition. And that's how we got our start.
Yeah, thank you, Esteban. I want to talk a little bit about the planning process and how it began. So similar to what Esteban was saying, with Donald Trump being elected in 2016, it's a lot of people were in emergency mode, emergency situations. And, currently as we see now and over the years of his administration, we've had to put out a lot of fires. There's so many things that we pulled together in. So I think the critical piece of this in the planning is that we had to be strategic. We had to be strategic with people's times, because everyone in the coalition, they also, not only we have to figure out things about immigration, but we had to figure out things about everything and anything. We had to, emergency. There was emergency something every day, so we had to figure it out. And so I think strategically we had to figure out, like, if we were going to do this, if we were going to create this local coalition to really figure out ways to protect our immigrant communities, we had to have an analysis, a power analysis that was very sharp, very strategic, and efficient, because we didn't have much time to actually get this done. And so and I think many organizations that were part of this coalition have their version of what power and power analysis is. And I think it was great. It was a great synergy, because we were able to bring together, for us, like locally, who are the businesses, who are the organizations, who are the commissioners, the city commissioners that actually had the power and needed to be moved. And as you see here, we were able to create this process where we knew who the decision makers were, and we knew how they felt based off previous conversations with them, where they were at on a spectrum. Did they support immigrant communities like they say they did with policy, or were they just really much status quo and like just went with what the status was, like what the status quo actually is? So I think in this process we were trying to determine, before we actually even went out and did anything, okay, this is the map of the city of Orlando. These are the big players when it comes to immigrant rights and immigrant justice, and just the topic of immigration itself. So where did they land, and how do we actually navigate this in a way to where like we know exactly where to go. We're not just coming up with things as we go along, because if we had done that, we would have not got anywhere near. It would have been 2020 today, and we would still be trying to fight for the Trust Act. So I think that's first and foremost, that's how we had to start before we actually had to move things. Because, you know, in this space, in this world, we experience tiredness and burnout all the time. And we could not have that because a lot of people's lives were at stake, and they still are at stake. So that's a little bit about the start with power mapping. And I'll leave it to Chris to talk about decision making, how we actually determine that.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And so after we did our power analysis, we recognized that our coalition was comprised of a cross-sector of organizations, each that were championing immigrant justice in their own way. And so we had organizations that were being led directly by and centered individuals who had mixed status, undocumented individuals, refugees, and other folks who were directly harmed by the injustices of the Trump administration and other anti-immigrant policies within the state of Florida. And so we wanted to be really mindful and intentional about how we proceeded as a coalition, because in our view, in order for us to truly bring forth immigrant justice, we needed to center directly impacted individuals. And so from that, us as facilitators convened together in order to build out a strategic process that we then presented back to members of our coalition that helped us in really just creating a voting system that gave weighted decision-making power to directly impacted individuals and organizations, and being and trusting in our membership of the coalition that when they say they are representing directly impacted people, or that when they themselves are directly impacted as an organization, that we believe them, and that we allow them to make those decisions to help steer the direction of the coalition. And that even takes the form of why we are in this space as folks who are helping to facilitate the conversations, as opposed to a more traditional approach of a coalition having, a leadership structure. For us, we're really here and have been involved in a coalition to help facilitate a dialogue, and really lending power and space to directly impacted folks, and we are following their lead. And so from that, we built out this voting structure, and we built out this process that helped us to institute the things that Jonathan mentioned when we were talking about power mapping. And so when we decided on what our course of action was going to be, through escalation, through direct action, and through identifying a regional champion in our city to help us move forward in passing this policy, that voting structure was very key so that we could move forward in having a really comprehensive conversation with our local elected officials about the importance of passing the Trust Act. So I'm actually going to throw it back to Jonathan so he could talk about our local champion that helped us to move this forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I just want to add on to what they were saying in the fact that, we obviously, the people that are going to move it are directly impacted communities. So we wanted to really be led by them. And I think part of that is not just in decision making, but even in terms of our messaging, in terms of our communication, like who's out there actually giving the message, we actually put that into account too. So it's not just people out there for show, actually they're actually part of decision making too. So I think when we came into like, okay, we have an analysis of who the people are in the commission that can actually give us the things that we want. It was now like, how do we strategically talk to our city commissioners? Because that's where we landed. How do we talk to them in a way that it really makes impact? Because if it was just me talking to a commissioner in a district that I'm not in, we're not going to be moved. As much as somebody that actually lives there is actually directly impacted by the issues at stake. So I think that's where our mindset was. And I think that's where our mindset has always been as a coalition, even before we even met, to move in this work. And so, with that came a lot of struggles because, I think part of this urgent moment and even the moment now we experience now is that a lot of the traditions change, and a lot of how we move things change. So we landed on Tony Ortiz, who is still currently a commissioner in the city of Orlando, in District 2, mainly because in his district it's a huge population of folks that are immigrants and refugees, and so he has a big population of these folks, and I think we thought at the time it was extremely important for him to be the champion in the city council, because he comes from communities and he represents communities that are directly impacted by this issue around the Trust Act, which we eventually got to pass. So I think that's the person that we keyed in on. Although we knew that the mayor is ultimately the decision maker, Tony Ortiz could apply enough pressure to the mayor to be like, okay, this is a serious issue because these are my constituents and I have to answer to them. I'm accountable to them. That was the mindset going into it. And, with that came a lot of struggles. It came a lot of back and forth, which I'm sure we'll talk about, because struggles, it's called a struggle for a reason, and it does exist. And I think part of that was, understanding the power balance, is that we are your constituents. And so you actually are accountable to us, not the other way around. So there was one case where, Aziri, who was a leader with one of the organizations, Mi Familia Vota, was, excluded from the meeting. And, her story had a lot of impact because she is a DACA recipient. She is extremely affected by the Trump administration's policies. And so to have her not being there in the space when we were meeting with the commissioner Ortiz over and over again, that just was not acceptable to us. So there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of struggles as to, who actually sets the tone. And, us being strategic is like, in that is like, this, again, is someone that's directly impacted. And, at the end of the day, the community is going to be the ones making the decisions. So, there was a lot of struggle within that. And then eventually, he warmed up to it. But it took a lot of organizing, a lot of pressure on our end to actually make that happen. So I think it's, again, speaking to the strategicness and the mindset you always have to have constantly when you're thinking about just not only the Trust Act, but anything that you do, is that, again, it's not just about having people for show, like how people that are impacted actually part of your strategy, and how it makes sense that everybody understands, not just the people on the core understand and like you let people know, but how is it more broad so everybody is clear and aligned on the same language. So that's where we're at, and I want to pass it to Rasha to talk a little bit about how we escalated the campaign.
Hey, thanks, John. My name is Rasha, and it's an honor to be in community with you all. Thank you, Weavestail, Sion, Basma, and Spencer. I know y'all have put in a lot of work. And to my co-panelists, it's just been like a whirlwind of emotions and memories. Yesterday actually marks 2 years since the Trust Act passed. So it's definitely appropriate and relative to be in community with the rest of all of y'all. And so, escalation. I think that's a huge component leading up to trying to pass legislation, even on a municipal level. So escalation is a lot of factors. In the activism world, sometimes you hear that different aspects is liberate us, free us. But in reality, it's every aspect. It's taking it to the streets. It's legislation. It's media. It's being able to mobilize and organize and be in community, especially with those most marginalized, disenfranchised. So with the Trust Coalition, what's so critical is that we embodied all of that. We were so strategic and intentional with over 38 advocacy organizations, whether their focus was on immigration or they did immigration work, and of course, individuals. So everybody brought something to the table. So when it came to escalation, we obviously mapped it out. We took it back to the drawing boards. We had identified our champion at the time. We had struggled with our champion, and we decided that we got a hard no from the mayor and the city of Orlando. And basically, one of the meetings that we got the hard no was in Mi Familia Vota's office, with the help of Esteban and a lot of folks. It was an indoor meeting that was closed, no media, no cameras. And basically, we had an undocumented young girl make the final ask to the mayor of Orlando. And we had story sharing, we had making sure that we represented and demonstrated the impact of communities, not just by stories, but also grounding it in the seriousness of the nature of this subject. Like, this is real. Families are separated. People are being discriminated against, and people are living in fear. So when we got that, we said, let's do this. It's time for escalation, which, again, we made sure that the type of escalation organizations understood and were in agreement with through the processes that Christopher talked about, through voting and through making sure that people were in the right room and making sure that there was a comfort level. So one of the actions was the solidarity action in the city commissioner hearing. Basically, after we testified and shared our stories, we began to sing. And it was this powerful moment where people were drumming, people were singing, and there were sounds of liberation and freedom that are deeply rooted in the Black struggle and the Indigenous struggle. And we made sure that we had the mayor and the commissioners hear it. That made headlines in Spanish radio and Latinx media and local news. And the mayor and the commissioners were taken back by it. And we were there to like make a system and also show that there's resistance through the arts and that we're not backing down. We've met with all the commissioners, we've met with the mayor, we've asked very clear asks. And at that point, we were saying this is moving into escalation. And that was just the beginning of it. We had what we called Trust Week, which went for an entire week. And basically, different organizations throughout each day held an event, whether it was the Dolores Huerta movie sharing where she called in. It was having different art exhibits, having different events to where we gave thanks within the Muslim community. Making sure that when we say we're in relationship, we understand that being in relationship is to struggle even within our own relationships and understanding one another. So we had those events, and one of the events that week was this bus that came through, and it shared different, you got to go there, and the mayor was having a press conference there with one of the organizations to talk about his support and the city's support for immigration. And basically people took their picture and they posted it on a wall. I think we have a video, so I guess we can share the video right now.
It's showing. The video is showing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Is there audio?
No, there's no audio. Just
okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can't hear the powerful speech happening, but this is just one of the moments that we convened. And you can see, like, there's different organizational T-shirts, different unions, different immigration groups from TPS to Muslim Band to Dreamers. All of us were together in solidarity. And this is one of the kickoff moments that we had for Trust Week. We actually had another event that launched off the Trust campaign. And then, so I'm going back to this wall where you got to go to this bus and take a picture and display your picture and share your story in a video on the bus. But we showed up, as you can see, that's David, and we're wearing the Trust. We literally found white T-shirts and markers in people's vehicles, and we wrote Trust Act on our T-shirts. And we showed up to that press conference saying, like, you cannot talk about the immigration issue and continue to have turned your back on us this far. This is a part of escalation where we've tried to be asking you for a clear answer, but now we're going to agitate, which means to move people to be better. So we took our pictures in our Trust Act, and we made sure that the mayor and his administration and the city saw us. And if you actually see to the picture to the left, you can see David's picture is right next to the mayor, and mine's a couple pictures down. But this is something that was displayed in Orlando for several months. So we obviously wanted to display power in different ways by mobilizing these organizations and delivering our stories about why we need this. So we had the public pronouncement of the Trust Coalition, and we make sure to be focused on representing and demonstrating the impact on these communities. So this is how we built momentum and how we stayed focused on not just celebrate, but touching in with our most impacted communities about, are we going to continue this fight? Y'all, this was a 1.5 year long fight. This was a 1.5 year long fight. And several times we had to revisit, do we want to continue the fight? Because people were exhausted. We didn't want people to lose hope. And we said, we're going to continue to fight for this. And in the same time where we had these disputable moments with the mayor himself and our commissioners and even our champion, there we were 1.5 years later, standing shoulder to shoulder with all these people. There's a Arabic proverb that says, which literally means that the person who succeeds has 100 fathers claiming them, and the person who struggles is an orphan. And some with the Trust Coalition is that when we did win, all the elected officials or leadership that are not only complicit and silent or trying to shut us down, we're fighting to stand next to us on this huge platform because they knew that this was something historic that so many people wanted to be a part of. And I think, the Trust Coalition, it served its purpose. And now we are greeted with some legislation, state legislation that's trying to counter that. But basically, we understood more than anything is to be in struggle together, to be in relationship with one another. We had to agitate ourselves and push the self-interest of the coalition. And we succeeded 2 years ago on this day yesterday. I'm going to pass it back to Sion.
Well, thank you so much, Raja. I mean, these photos, it's clear just, how the level of interest and the passion that was in the public in support of this program. So I think maybe we can go back, give the microphone back to Esteban to talk about the actual passage of the Trust Act.
Oh yeah, sorry Esteban, did I got
I took it and then I gave it back.
So, a couple years ago, our campaign reached its end, and getting there was a lot of negotiation that happened with the city attorney, with I think the city staff on behalf of the mayor, with our champion, where it was a negotiation of what we initially wanted to see, language that was going to be in the then resolution. Was it a resolution versus an ordinance? And kind of like a discussion of how much can we agree on and receive on behalf of the community as a win, but while not losing our principles and our values and why we were in this. And it ended with a resolution called the Trust Act resolution that outlined a full agreement, I think, on both sides of what the language should be. But in addition to that, it was also the promise to start to build a multicultural affairs advisory board. Initially, the idea was an immigrant affairs advisory board. But that was in negotiation as well and back and forth. What it ended up being was a multicultural affairs advisory board that's still in its first year this year, but it has, it is alive, it is built. And the final, kind of negotiation that we got to accept this was an agreement for a seat on the Police Accountability Review Board, the Citizens Review Board, as part of what we were going to, kind of walk away with this, on behalf of the community that we were in this struggle with the city of Orlando. And you see on the left, this is the day that the Trust Act was going to pass. There was a press conference in front of City Hall outside before the hearing. On the right, a photo of during the hearing. And this is the overflow room as well. The room, the chambers had to be moved because of construction. So there was just a room parallel to this overflow room that was packed with our supporters and other folks as well. So we had to fill the overflow room as much as we could. And it was a celebratory day. We won, and it led to it being noticed, I think by the media. There's some news clips on the next slide. What that helped do also was get the attention of the city of Kissimmee. And I don't know, Rasha, if you want to speak to that, or I'll pause there. Yeah.
No, I think you're doing great. Keep going. I'll add anything.
Sounds good. So the city of Kissimmee then met with members of the Trust Coalition to see what could be done in the city of Kissimmee. And sometime, after June 2018, the city of Kissimmee also passed the Trust Act. So it kind of had a ripple effect. And the language was very similar to what was passed in Orlando. And I think that goes to show, the organizing that happened in Orlando with directly impacted partners, allies. It was a solid campaign that met a goal, and it was solid enough that it caught the attention of neighboring municipalities, right? So this is a few of the clips here that covered it. I'm not sure if there are clips on Kissimmee, but Kissimmee, for those that don't know, is just one city south of Orlando, or one county south of Orlando. It's very close. They're kind of in the same metro region, I guess you could say. And I'll pause there. That was the city of Kissimmee. I don't know if my fellow facilitators had anything else to add there, but I think that wraps up that.
I think the other thing I just would add, because everyone's done a great job, is it was history, not just in Orlando or Kissimmee or Florida, but in the southeast region of this country, and it's the first of its kind. So it is something to be proud of in that aspect. But I think the proudest aspect of it for so many of us is how we stayed intentional, how we continued to uplift the voices of the most marginalized, the most impacted. And I truly believe that is why we win, and that's the only way you win.
Does anyone want to add anything onto that? Well, I would thank you so much for the great presentation. It's certainly, I've heard so much about the work that the coalition has done, and I'm just so glad that I was able to have you guys and really to go over all of these different processes that you had to go through in your 18 months journey. So I really appreciate that. Since this today, or maybe I think I was told that it was yesterday, that marked the 2-year anniversary of the passing of the act. Have you been able to collect any maybe like feedback or talk to the immigrant community as to what the impact has been of the policy?
I don't think Chris, you want to add?
Yeah, so I can add, after, and this goes into like state politics. So after the Trust Act was passed, the state legislature introduced a litany of anti-immigrant bills, which was probably the most difficult legislative session that we had had in Florida in a really long time in regards to immigrant justice. And they passed what is referred to as Senate Bill 168, or the Federal Immigration Act, which would ban all sanctuary cities across Florida. And Florida at the time did not have any sanctuary cities. And it also requires law enforcement and members of local governments to comply with their best efforts, or to reinforce best efforts to comply with federal immigration. And so while we had this incredible victory with the Trust Act, immediately after, we had to then navigate through combating SB 168, which unfortunately was signed into law. And so what happened with our communities that were directly impacted is that their focus went from celebrating this huge victory that made Orlando and made Kissimmee these welcoming and inclusive cities for immigrants, to now having to fear that crossing city, crossing county lines, they would be met with some kind of anti-immigrant enforcement. And so really, for us as facilitators and individuals working within our organizations, we were active in challenging these laws and are continuing to push this fight forward so that we can deconstruct what is a very bad law in our state, and put pressure on the elected officials that would want to and continue to introduce these hateful, bigoted, and anti-immigrant laws at the state level that scapegoat our communities, and that reinforce the notion, a negative notion around immigrants, who are the lifeblood of our communities, who are the doctors, who are the students, who are the family members, who are the loved ones in our own communities and in our hearts, who are seen and who are demonized by a rise in nationalist hate groups, by a rise in ultra-conservative individuals who are following under the doctrine of this administration, which has the ear of our state legislature and our governor.
Jonathan or Rasha, did you guys have anything to add to that? We do have, yeah, Rasha.
I think Christopher hit it on the nail. Obviously, like, the work continues. And it just goes to show that the impact is far larger than what we imagine that state legislation would want to disrupt it on a municipal level, and trying to rock not just these advocacy groups, but the immigrant communities, which is terrible and awful. And so many of us, including the Trust Coalition, recommitted ourselves to continuing this fight. And we understood that the fight is not over, especially in Florida, far from over.
In a way, it almost seems like what you guys did was the very beginning of everything, right? The beginning of, and the peak, the beginning of everything, the fight that's still going on, especially in Florida. We actually have some questions from the audience, and we had two great questions from Veronica in the audience. I'm just going to read it out to you guys. Since the passing of SB 168, have you seen any issues raised by the state in regards to the Trust Act? That is, has the state tried to say that the city is limiting cooperation with ICE, and therefore violating SB 168? Filing the bill's language that says a law enforcement agency shall use best efforts to support the enforcement of federal immigration law?
If I can take this one,
Yeah.
this is a legalese heavy question, and I'll draw from, I think, the experience from the Trust Coalition that, and I'll promise I'll come back to the question, but in the formation of this coalition, we identified different sectors of community that it would be best to have in the coalition. So we had labor, we had faith, we had a few other sectors, and one of those sectors was also legal experts, right? because in meetings with elected officials or to sharpen our understanding of the language that we wanted to put forward, I don't think many of us were attorneys, but we had attorneys present that could lend a hand and add their expertise. Everyone had, something that they were contributing to the effort. So we were tapping folks, Latino Justice, the Asian American Advancing Justice Center, and other legal entities to try to understand this Endelon. So we had those folks that helped consulted and made sure that we were on our P's and Q's, I think is the saying. We did not have pushback that I'm aware of with regards to this, because what we were asking Orlando to do was stay within the confines of the Constitution and not essentially unconstitutionally hold on to someone. Right? There has to be probable cause. There has to be a signed detainer by a judge as to why someone's being held and detained and transferred over. If that does not exist, that person has to be let go. That, and on top of the fact that Orlando doesn't have a jail, but nonetheless, we were refining the language of this resolution to apply as best as it could to Orlando. So I think regarding the question, I'm not an attorney, but I believe we were within the full parameters of the law to make sure that this was moved forward and it didn't violate any U.S. code.
I want to underscore what Esteban said. All of that, as far as the Trust Act would still be applied in practice in the city of Orlando. The only pushback I think that I experienced is when SB 168, when we wanted to gather folks to speak out against SB 168, Sheriff Mina actually used that Trust Act as an excuse that why he couldn't come out and speak out. And I think that, again, that goes back to people that are, unconditional in their support for real change, and people that allow it to really hinder their decision making and how they show up for the community. And I think it's important to name that.
We had another question from the same person, Veronica. I'm also curious if you've had any pushback from the federal government in regards to the U.S. Code 1373, which is communication between government agencies and the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the laws of federal grant funds.
Sorry, I think I actually answered that one in my previous, and I missed the SB 168.
It was kind of on the answering both questions in a way. Veronica, if you have some follow-up questions, feel free to include them in the Q&A. Yes.
I would just name that reasoning was a pushback reason that why they didn't want to pass the Trust Act in the city of Orlando is this fear of losing federal funds. And that was like a talking point and what they tried to push. And like Esteban explained, that it wasn't.
Okay. I mean, in doing this, I kind of, the part where Jonathan said earlier in the webinar that there was this strong need to have the right narratives presented to the people, especially to the decision makers, the politicians, and making this happen was something that was really interesting to me personally. So I think in a way, the approach that you guys took is about the narratives, and I think that was one of the ways that you guys were able to overcome the pushbacks that were present. So we have another question. If any other cities or regions, counties were to pass something very similar to what you guys did, what would you recommend that they do? Where should they go and learn more about the Trust Act and what they should be doing in order to achieve it?
So I think to jump in, and I see Esteban wants to also jump in, so I'll pass it over to him after. But I think this is kind of the framework, right? Like we have walked through the steps on how the coalition, how a coalition of individuals who want to push for pro-immigrant policies in their region can be galvanized to move together by a common ideology. The steps to organizing by assessing, like, who are the movers and shakers, like who are the electeds in your region that have the power to make that change and institutionalize it, and then finding out among those individuals who is a likely champion and who are unlikely allies. And as Jonathan was mentioning earlier, making sure that when we have these in-depth conversations with these elected officials in your county or your city, that you are being strategic in, of course, always centering directly impacted communities, but making sure that the folks who are in those meetings with these individuals are not only representing the constituency base, but representing the ideologies that matter the most to that elected official. And so when we were selecting folks, when we were trying to organize these meetings with electeds, we were making sure that it was not just folks from the coalition who were directly impacted, but also making sure that the folks that were meeting with the elected officials were also part of the communities that they have been so vocal in championing for in the past. And that they were going to continue to put that pressure and that message that we are unified in this struggle. Yeah, and so from power mapping to moving with really clear asks, and when you get shut down, as Rasha explained, you gotta push back in your own way, and that's through escalation, and that can sometimes be scary. Going out and being vocal and putting yourself out on the line. However, we saw it as a great victory here, and we continue to see that as a testament for movement work, right? Like, we can institute change when we are unapologetic in our nature and in our activism, and when we are not asking for change, but demanding it for the sake of our communities. So I'm going to pass it off to Esteban, who can probably give a little bit more clarity.
I have nothing to add to that. That was great. If I could add something, I'd say if you're looking for folks to touch base with, you have, I think, 36, we didn't mention it, there's 36 organizations that ended up being part of the Trust Coalition here. And there are, at least a dozen experts, I think, on the Trust Act and how it came to be, if not more, right? So you have, your choice of folks to reach out to here in Orlando for sure, that I'm sure would be willing to touch base. And I think that's also a testament to the space that was created, that it was a learning space. It was a learning space for a lot of different aspects of what it took to make this real, from, decision making, figuring it out, thinking it through. There's a lot of folks that put time and energy behind trying to figure that out and make it equitable and make it make sense, to the nuts and bolts of an action, the purpose, the outcome, in the process, to timelining, what an escalation timeline could look like, and contacting the media, the narrative, this, that, and the third. There's so much that went into the coalition process of determining what was next, that I think for many folks it was also a learning process, and myself included, of working in collaboration with a coalition of this size.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah, and I think hopefully this adds to the answer a little bit. The reality in 2016 through 2018 is not the reality now. And, it's, for me, based off of my work, it's all about relationship building, because this is a long-term thing. The struggle for immigrant rights, like folks have said, did not end with the passage of this Trust Act. And I think now, depending what happens this year or next year, we might be in a situation where we have to be doing something even more radical than this. Because I think, the difference now is that, especially in this pandemic, a lot of officials, elected officials, have more power than they initially said they did. I think when the state passed the Senate Bill 168, it really exposed level of willingness that local officials would have to like really actively fighting against it. So, when it passed, like, oh, well, the state said this, so we're not going to do it anymore. But now we see, the state is passing things around, particularly around the pandemic, and cities are pushing back. It's like, no, actually, no, we're going to do it this way. So realities have changed a little bit in that sense. And I think depending where you are in the United States, we have the tools. This is what we did in Florida, but it might not mean the same thing in Georgia. It might not mean the same thing in Idaho. It might not mean the same thing in California. So it's just really assessing what people on the ground, the people that actually you need to actually build, what they want and need. Because what they want is possible, no matter what like the official says. We've seen that now. Like a lot of things that we were thought of as impossible are now possible all of a sudden. And it just takes political will. And we're in a situation now where political will is very much necessary because we are in a crisis, politically, economically, socially. So yeah, it's just really, but as long as you have the relationships built, that really helps you along the way in determining what actually is possible.
That leads me to think of, to ask you if you guys had the chance to consult with or to communicate with the Trust Coalition in Texas or any other similar organizations out of state as you were working on this project?
Esteban, maybe you can talk about Boston and actually how Ortiz went out to Boston just to meet.
So the city of Boston passed the Trust Act, and we had shared this with Commissioner Ortiz, and it prompted eventually Commissioner Ortiz to make it up to Boston to learn a little bit more of how that happened up there. And it was a different effort up there. It was, I think, a split coalition effort, but so, that happened. Some of the orgs I mentioned previously who are experts in some of this legislation are from out of state. Asian Americans Advancing Justice are based out in California, I believe. Endelon also based out of California. Endelon's National Day Labor Organizing Network. And yeah, so there are folks outside of state for sure that we consulted with that helped the coalition tremendously. And I did hear about the Trust group in Texas, but I think that it came together separately from the efforts in Orlando, if I'm not mistaken.
But it also not only did like beforehand, but after the fact, we had several states reaching out. I know that Alabama reached out, wanting to see how they can model a trust act that made sense for them and their communities. So there was a lot of inspiration that came out of this win and this passage for sure.
And that's one of the goals of this webinar series. We're trying to, feature these unique practices in immigrant advocacy and protection in order for other communities in Florida to be able to emulate these models and then apply them in their own regions. I think that it goes well with this question or / comment that came from Veronica. She was following up with to the questions that she had. So the reason why she asked all these questions about the legal sides of it is because, according to her, because her local officials, specifically the city attorney, has been using both of these as an excuse to not go forward with similar legislation in Gainesville, Florida. And she's based in North Florida, and she's trying to push forward the Trust Act idea. So I think overall, it would be really good if you guys can touch upon some of the things, like in the case of North Florida, in the case of Gainesville, what you would suggest, what you would recommend Veronica to pursue in order to achieve pushing this forward in the presence of all these repercussions and pushbacks.
Yeah. Veronica, that's amazing. That made my heart so full. That's great to hear. I think, in Florida, we've learned as organizers that what might work for Orlando might not work for Tampa, which is an hour away, right? Even the outer skirts of Orlando. But so an assessment and needs analysis of what Gainesville needs. And I think one of the biggest questions that the city and the county and the sheriff and the mayor and the OPD kept trying to throw around is where the jail was and who was in charge of the jail. And so there's a lot of that question, but I think a lot of us on this call are happy to jump on a call with Veronica and Veronica's team as far as what that might look like, but definitely who y'all are in relationship with and what power mapping is. I mean, our champion was a Puerto Rican Republican, right? And I think that speaks volumes for a city that deems themselves so progressive, and understanding just, a needs analysis, but also who's in relationship with who and who you can push and agitate when you're in relationship with these folks, and what is the self-interest and their agendas of your commissioners, and what is their 5-year plan, what are they trying to run for, and trying to understand each of their agendas, their self-interest, but also the language, right? Like how do you meet them in conversation and communicate with them? So I think that also staying grounded in the values of the coalition and establishing your values and making sure that what it is that you achieve, being very clear in all of that process. Honestly, like if you need anything, I don't want to offer everyone else, but like, I'm happy to jump on.
I think it would be good if you guys can share in the chat your email address so people can contact you and follow up with you guys if needed. And I think Christopher had something to add to that.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, from our experience in working with city attorneys, like they will always take the most conservative approach because their job is to try to protect the best interests of the city. And so the fear of, pushing outside of that scope can sometimes lead them to find multiple or create multiple rationale why they can't do something. And so the job of, our role and our responsibility as folks who are organizing is to push back as much as possible and to say, like, the possibility, like, is there and we can imagine it together. Like, let us be in relationship with each other. Like, let's have a really frank conversation about like what the fear is. Because throwing out a policy saying, well, we can't do it because of this, like, there is a legal recourse that we can walk around that, because for every law, there's always a loophole. And so we can break through that together. And so as Rasha said, like, it's important to be in relationship with these folks, and to have really strong and really skilled team of legal experts on your side. I mean, we had incredible folks who were organizing with us on the ground, from Latino Justice to Asian Americans, to some other like folks who have a background and who have a background in law and who are a part of the bar, who are just offering their in-kind services to help us work through these conversations with our local cities. So it's important to be able to be in relationship, not just with the folks who have a legal expertise, but also to be in relationship with the city as much as possible, so that you can leverage those relationships to say, like, let us reimagine what the law can say for us for the benefit of our community. Yes,
and everything Christopher said, and I just like when Christopher said, like, we had experts on. And ask you what I imagine. Like, we had people when we would be so intentional with our meetings. When we would go in a meeting, we know who was sitting next to who and who was going to be that person making the ask, agitation, and the closing. We even had a person that was reading body language and gestures to the reactions of some of our comments and seeing how their body reacted or their facial expression, if they were taking notes, if they were looking at each other. And also something we provided in these meetings, we knew some of the pushback that they would give, and we had pivot responses, how to respond to their pushback, and being very prepared as much as we could be. And it was very specific on who was going to react to which response, for sure.
Yeah, I would just add to piggyback on both what Christopher and Rasha mentioned is that some of our most intense meetings, I feel, were with city attorneys of some sort. The police department's attorneys or the mayor's, the city attorney, and it's always helpful to have an attorney on your side present with you as well, so legalese can battle legalese, or however you want to say it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ingrid Morfa, who was key to some of those discussions as well.
Yeah, if I can add just one more piece is, I would love to connect. And, again, it's like I'm saying about the reality of the situation now. Back then when we were discussing with the city attorney, it was like, oh no, if we do this, that means we have to, lose grant funding for policing, or we'll have to punish police if they break the law. It's like, okay, well, now we're in 2020 where you can say defund police without any like nobody's gonna be like, oh no. Like, so the situation now has changed so much where it's like, okay, well, all right, if there are consequences to actions, then that's what it should be, because it really boils down to policing. That's what encouraged this coalition to form in the first place. So conditions have changed so much now. It should be like, to use that as an excuse at this point. I don't know what the all inner works and games were, but there's this precedent now set where it's like you can actually challenge those things, as we couldn't do as effectively before.
Well, I think this all boils down to the one last question that I have for all of you. The goal of this whole project, what we're doing right now, is really to find out how we can make Florida a more inclusive and immigrant-friendly place for everybody in the next 10 years and the next 20 years. So that is actually my question. For a better future of immigration in Florida in the next 10 to 20 years, what do you think is most urgent and most important in bringing the right change in the context of especially Central Florida, because that's where you guys are based in? Sure, yeah, Christopher, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think it comes in the form of two things. For Florida, the first is right now there is a collective of organizations that are being backed by the Southern Poverty Law Center that have filed a suit against the governor and the state attorney to undo SB 168, which is a hateful law that is directly targeting and criminalizing members of our immigrant families. And so the first thing that we need to do is to win that lawsuit and to dismantle SB 168. And the second thing that we need to do to ensure that our communities are not criminalized for something as trivial as driving without a license is to make sure that our communities have access to driver's licenses, particularly undocumented communities, because someone should not be criminalized for taking their children to school. Someone should not be criminalized for having to go to a grocery store, or having to go to a doctor's appointment, or having to go to work. Or just driving in general and just living as a person, right? Like, it's unjust and it's unconscionable that we would continue to, at this point, when there has precedent that has been set in other states, that we would not allow this to happen in Florida. So those are like my two lofty visions for what we need to do for our communities.
Thank you for that, Christopher. I can't agree more. And the fact that you brought up the ID and the problem of getting, for the undocumented communities, the issue of not being able to have the right papers and the documents. We are actually next Friday, we're actually hosting another webinar that's going to touch upon the community ID program that was passed in Alachua County. So it would, if the people in the audience could keep their interest in the webinar, there will be a chance for them to also learn about what they can do with the community ID program. Jonathan, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I agree with everything that Christopher said, and I would add to that saying that again, the reason why we are together here, the reason why we were so fearful of Trump administration when he was elected, is because he has federal power, and with the governors has not changed. Like DeSantis is here, but he's no different from Rick Scott, as we've seen. Is that they have the power of the police? So I think in long term, and it's not just defined with immigrant communities. I think just any marginalized community in this area, no matter whether it's around race, gender, sexual orientation, immigrant status, or class status too. It's how do we separating communities from the police? Like how are we driving a wedge so it's more distance? Because the issue, it seems, and it's coming out of this, and we see it today, why these uprisings are continuing constantly and incessantly, is that their interactions, when the police are interacting with communities, that just leads to bad results all the time. So what are ways are, it's the buzzword is defunding, and the buzzword is like, what's police reform? But what are the measures there that are in place that, the interactions are less frequent? At least, obviously, no police is like hard. You can't imagine that it's not gonna happen overnight, but like, what are the steps that need to be taken so there's at least a separation, so like communities can just be at peace, like Christopher was saying, like people can just live their lives in a way that's respectable and to them as a person. And I think the only way that can happen in regards to this, in regards to many issues, is what are things that we can push, and what are elements we can have to where that there's a gap there so people can actually live their lives.
I think that is such an excellent point, especially given what's happening right now throughout the country. And it's also so fundamental, right? It's so basic that in a way, if we achieve that, then it will definitely bring us closer to the next steps that we have to take. So I think that's a really good point. Esteban, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the question. And I was thinking about it, as my fellow panelists were responding. I think that something that's key, and it sounds, it may sound like kind of trivial or whatnot, but we need to continue organizing, and organizing at the local level. I think it's so important to that's like the foundation, I think, of so much that can happen, right? And it's campaigns such as this one that help inspire and inform folks of like how we can come together to make this change happen. We were in a meeting with an elected official, I won't say which one, during this process, and there was almost a civics lesson in how, what we need to do to pass a piece of legislation or an ordinance or something. And the reality was that, I don't know if this elected official realized it, but we went about it the community way. And it got done. And I think that's such an important takeaway from this space, but that happens at a local level. And if we have more and more organizing, politicization of our community at the local level, we will be in a much stronger position to pass so many of these things that need to happen,
right? Of course, I can ask a lot of additional follow-up questions to that, to the organizing issue and everything, especially with the shutdown and the limitation of being able to travel around. But I think I'm gonna, for the time, I think I'm gonna give the microphone to our last answer from Rasha.
Yes, everything that everyone said. Underscore. Yeah, I want to add to it in a different way, because all of those, and I think the way it ends is pretty good, because it's like chronologically, I think the pieces that Christopher, John, and Esteban all held. I also think that when we think about movement, and we think about community building, and we're thinking about uplifting the most vulnerable communities, I think we are living in a moment where we're drawing a line in the sand. And basically we're saying that, you're either for justice and equity for all people or you're not. And I think that it's important that sometimes when we're, a lot of us are advocates and activists, and your focus might be somewhere else, but it's really important to be intersectional. And I think that's my take home message, is that making sure that when we're talking about immigration, that you are also you're fighting for Black lives, because we have to understand that there is no freedom and liberation and equality for any of us if we're not serving as an ally for Black lives or being on the forefront and making sure that we are fighting for that. And I think, so for my message is that the only way that you're able to win any piece of legislation or movement or is being in community with all people. And sometimes even in progressive spaces, there's this belief of, well, if we leave your issue to the side, we're just trying to win for these people. Because, do you really care about immigrants? If you really care about immigrants, then you would put your issue on hold. And sometimes that is a leading factor in even these spaces. And I really want to caution folks to not be that. I know that we all create harm or in different ways, but really trying to be cognitive of that and understanding that liberation and freedom is only going to happen and when it's tied, and it really tied with all of us and fighting for it for all people. And I just want to really reiterate that, and what it means to be in community and what it means to be in relationship. To be in relationship literally means to be in the struggle with one another, to even agitate each other to be better. So when you're thinking about trust acts and you're thinking about what wins in the immigration community looks like, make sure that you are uplifting queer folk, you are uplifting trans folk, right? Black women, all of the Palestinians, all of these issues. And I think that having that lens is really going to help you understand liberation and freedom in the way that you're trying to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. That is it's so relevant to what's happening right now these days. And I really loved your point about the intersectionality of everything. We're all connected these days. There's no one-dimensional issue that we can just address with one solution. Everything is so interconnected, and I think it's more relevant to the immigrant communities because there's that intersectionality of the issues that immigrant communities are going through. So I really appreciate that, the last remark that you made, Rasha. Great. So that's really the end of our webinar today. I hope you all enjoyed the program that we have prepared. And thank you so much for our great speakers that were able to give us a really nice background and history of the Trust Coalition. And of course, they have left their email addresses in the chat, so you guys are welcome to follow up with them individually. And also, I would like to thank our sponsors who have made this program possible, including Islamic Relief USA, Welcoming Gainesville, ACLU Florida, Reyes Legal PLC, Mubarak Law, Engage, Florida Immigrant Coalition, We Are All America, Welcoming America, CARE Florida, the Law Office of Karen Winston, Women's March Jacksonville, Human Rights Coalition of Alachua County, Southern Poverty Law Center, UF, Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and Gators for Refugee Medical Relief. Thank you all so much. And before you leave the meeting, please make sure that you have answered the poll at the very end of the presentation, because we would love your feedback. And also consider joining us next Friday at noon for another webinar that will be led by Liz from Human Rights Coalition of Alachua County, who'll be talking about her experience of working with the communities in Alachua County and the politician in bringing the community ID program to fruition. So you can always go on to our Eventbrite page, forwardtogetherfl.eventbrite.com. It's the same page that you guys all registered. And you can RSVP, and we'll be sending you a Zoom link as always. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. It was a lot of fun having you. And also, just to let you know, a video recording of today's webinar will be up on our YouTube channel, and you should be, if you have registered with us on the Eventbrite page, you'll be getting an email about that. So thank you again so much. I hope you all have a great weekend, and bye-bye. Thank you.